Inside the settler's cabin, the light from the hearth flickered low, half-starved like the woman who crouched on the blood-stained floorboards. Florence May's breath came in shallow gasps, her knuckles white as she clutched the edge of the wooden bedpost, the only thing keeping her upright. Her hair clung to her face, slick with sweat, and her legs trembled beneath her calico dress, soaked through with the pain of labor. She was alone. Not by accident. The baby should have cried by now. Florence blinked, blinking again, but the image didn't change. A still shape lay in the cradle basket she'd carved from willow branches and padded with the last of her worn linens. A face too quiet. Skin too pale. No breath rising. No sound, no life. Just the silence of something unfinished. The fire popped in the hearth as if to protest it, a single coal flaring up before falling quiet again. She crawled, slowly, dragging herself forward. Her hands left red smears along the floor. When she reached the cradle, her hands shook too badly to lift the baby. She touched its face with the back of her fingers. Cold. Not icy, just final. A soft sound escaped her lips. Not quite a word. Not a cry either. Just something broken, unformed, like the child who would never open its eyes. Outside, the snow began to fall harder. The cabin door creaked open. Evan Broderick stepped in, smelling of tobacco and wet leather, snowflakes caught in his beard. He paused only a second to take in the sight, the cradle, the blood, the woman on her knees. He did not ask if the child had lived. He did not kneel beside her. He did not speak comfort. Instead, he slammed the door shut behind him and stomped his boots clean. "What use are you now?" he said flatly. Florence didn't answer. Her hand was still resting on the cradle's edge, frozen there, as if maybe she could warm the baby just enough to change something. Evan's voice rose, like whiskey that had turned to vinegar. "All that waiting, all that praying, and you give me nothing. Not even a scream." Florence finally turned her head, slow as thawing ice. "She was breathing," she whispered. "Before." He snorted, pulled off his gloves, and threw them on the table. "You buried us with her." She flinched at the sound of the chair scraping across the floor as he sat. The cradle creaked beside her, wind brushing along the cracks in the walls like ghostly fingers. The fire burned low. "I'll not raise a dead woman," Evan said after a long silence. "You hear me, Florence? You think you can just lie there and rot and drag me with you?" She stood. Somehow. Her knees nearly buckled, but she stood. "Then leave," she said, voice barely audible. Evan looked up. His eyes were a hard blue, like winter rivers before they split open with spring floods. "Don't tempt me." He stood too, grabbing his coat from the wall. He didn't approach her. Didn't say goodbye. He opened the door. But this time he didn't close it. Instead, he turned to her as snow blew in behind him and said, "Get out." Florence didn't move. "You heard me. Take your grief and go die with it. I've got no place for the both of you here." Still she stood. He took a step forward, grabbed her arm, roughly, without thought. Her body jerked from the pain. "You want to follow that thing into the ground? Be my guest. But not in my house. Not in my bed." He pushed her. Not hard, but hard enough. She stumbled backward. Her boots weren't on. Just socks, one soaked in blood. She slipped and caught herself against the doorframe. The cold bit into her skin like teeth. Outside, the snow came down thicker, fast and wild like ash falling from a burning sky. He threw a thin wool blanket at her feet. "Go cry where the trees can listen." Florence didn't beg, didn't scream. Her silence was louder than anything. She bent to pick up the blanket, wrapped it around herself with fingers that barely bent. The last thing she saw before stepping out into the storm was the cradle. Waiting. Unfilled. Then the door slammed shut. She walked. Not because she thought she'd find anything, but because standing still would be slower death. The forest opened its arms like a mother who knew sorrow. The wind wound through the pine trees, singing lullabies in a tongue older than language. The ground disappeared beneath the snowfall, leaving her footprints behind like soft ghosts. Each step was agony. Her feet cut by the ice. Her limbs trembling. Her stomach hollowed out. She walked until there was nothing behind her. She walked until the pain became rhythm. Until the moon vanished behind the thick clouds and even the sky refused to look down. There was no road. No landmark. Only cold and deeper cold. The trees began to blur into shapes. Faces. Memories. Evan shouting. The baby not crying. Her mama's voice when she was small. A lullaby about stars and shadows. She fell. The snow did not catch her gently. Her body hit with a dull thud, and her breath left her in a cloud. She stayed there, blanketed, as if the earth was tucking her in. So this was it. The white sky above her spun slowly, like the inside of a snow globe tipped by careless hands. She smiled, just barely. Then her eyes closed. And the snow kept falling. Somewhere, not far off, a raven called. A figure stepped out from the trees. Slow, tall. A blanket wrapped around his shoulders. The wind moved around him, not through him. He said nothing at first. He just watched her. And then he moved. He knelt. 2 hands, weathered, brown, gentle, brushed snow from her cheek. He touched her wrist. Still warm. The man looked up at the sky as if asking something silently. Then he lifted her in his arms like she weighed less than the grief that had held her down. And he walked. No words. Only footfalls in snow, fading into the pines. The cradle back in the cabin rocked once. And stopped. The world returned in fragments. Warmth first, then weight. Florence's eyelids fluttered open, though it felt like lifting stones. The sky was no longer above her, but timber. Smooth, hand-hewn beams. The scent of cedar wrapped around her like an old lullaby. Somewhere nearby, a fire crackled, low and steady, its light casting gentle shadows that moved like memory across the cabin walls. She didn't remember being carried. She didn't remember being saved. She only knew she wasn't cold anymore. A wool blanket cocooned her, thick and soft with a hand-woven texture. Her hands, pale and cracked, peeked out, resting against her belly. Her feet, washed, wrapped, and tucked beside a kettle of warm stones, throbbed faintly, like a reminder that she still lived. A figure sat across from her, near the hearth. Quiet. Watching, but not imposing. His profile was strong but solemn, carved like something out of earth and sky rather than flesh. He stirred something in the pot that steamed faintly, and when he noticed her eyes open, he gave a single, slow nod. "You lived," he said. His voice was deep, measured, not surprised, not relieved, as if the trees had told him she would. Florence tried to speak, but her throat rasped with dryness. He stood, crossed the room in 2 strides, and brought a carved wooden bowl to her lips. It held warm broth, thin, clear, but rich with something she couldn't place. She drank, and her eyes filled with tears that had nothing to do with pain. He didn't ask her name, didn't ask what had happened, didn't touch her again. When she finished the bowl, he set it aside and pulled a folded piece of hide from the bench beside her. He laid it in her lap, a pair of soft deerskin moccasins stitched by hand. "For your feet," he said, then returned to the fire. Florence whispered a thank you. He didn't reply, but his shoulders loosened just slightly. She slept again, and woke to snow falling softly against the window. She could hear the groan of the wind as it moved between the pines outside, like breath through bone. For the first time in what felt like years, she wasn't afraid of the dark. Over the next days, or maybe it was just one long day split by sleep, she learned his rhythm. He was a man of few movements and fewer words. He rose early, fed the horse, fetched water from the stream, then carved or stitched or sat beside the fire. His presence filled the cabin without demanding space. He didn't look at her often, but when he did, his gaze never lingered too long. Respectful. Detached, but not unkind. She found her voice slowly, first with soft thanks, then with questions. "What's your name?" she asked one morning, her voice still brittle as old parchment. "Tasani," he said, then returned to grinding herbs in a stone bowl. She rolled the name across her tongue. It felt like something solid, grounded, a name that belonged to the earth itself. "You saved me," she murmured. "I heard the forest cry," he replied. "The wind does not scream for nothing." It was not an answer she understood, not fully, but it warmed something buried in her chest. By the fourth day, she could walk without help, only to the threshold, where she sat wrapped in a shawl and stared at the woods. The snow was gentler now, falling in quiet sheets like a curtain of feathers. The trees stood tall and still, guardians of something sacred. She began to speak to them, not with words, but with the way her shoulders eased when she breathed deep, when her bare hands touched the wood frame of the doorway, when she hummed lullabies to the emptiness. The trees knew her name, somehow, before she even remembered it herself. "Florence," she said aloud one morning. "My name is Florence May." Tasani, who was splitting wood, paused only a moment before returning to his rhythm. The silence between them was no longer distance. It was something gentler, space, like soil gives to roots. He taught her how to dry meat, how to steep spruce tips for tea, how to use crushed willow bark for pain. She watched him work in quiet wonder. Everything he did was careful, deliberate, respectful. Even when he hunted, it was with grace. He apologized to the animal before he took its life, whispered words in a language she didn't know. When she asked about it, he only said, "The land listens." So I answer. One night, the wind howled louder than before. It rattled the shutters and snuffed the flame in the lantern. Florence jolted awake, heart racing, but Tasani was already near the hearth, feeding the fire back to life. She sat up, watching him. His face was lit orange gold, his eyes shadowed with thought. "Do you ever feel haunted?" she asked. He stirred the embers. "All who walk long enough feel followed," he said. "But not all shadows mean to harm us." She didn't respond, but she pulled her blanket tighter. Not for warmth, for memory. Later, after they both fell silent again, she whispered, "I had a daughter." Tasani looked up. "She never cried," Florence continued, voice cracking like frost underfoot. "She came too quiet, too still. I waited, but nothing." He didn't interrupt. She reached for the locket around her neck, small, silver, now tarnished with time. Inside it, pressed like a prayer, was a lock of downy hair and a name etched in tiny letters. Juniper. Tasani nodded slowly, almost reverently. "I will remember her name," he said. The tears that followed came silent and fierce. But they felt different this time, less like drowning, more like thaw. The next morning, Florence found a small bunch of wildflowers, frostbitten but beautiful, placed beside the hearth. No note, no word, but she knew. She hung them beside the locket on a nail in the wall. On the sixth day, she stood at the edge of the clearing outside the cabin, barefoot in the morning light. The snow was crusted now, the sun beginning to carve golden lines through the branches. She whispered something into the trees, just her daughter's name, and let the wind carry it. She turned to see Tasani watching from the cabin's doorway. There was no smile on his face, but something in his eyes had changed. Not pity, not even tenderness. Recognition. As if he understood what it was to bury love in snow. Florence took a few slow steps back toward the cabin, her arms crossed tightly around her chest, but her eyes held his for longer than they ever had. "Thank you," she said again. He nodded once. "You are healing." She shook her head, gently. "I don't know if I ever will." "You don't have to," he said. "You only have to walk." That evening, she cooked cornbread for the first time in weeks. Burned the bottom, but he ate it anyway. They sat across from each other as the fire cracked between them. No words were spoken, but a rhythm had begun. Not love, not yet, but something else. Safety. That rarest thing. Florence stared into the flames and thought, this is not a beginning. But maybe it is no longer an end. Outside, the trees whispered in the dark. They remembered her name. And in their memory, she began to remember herself. The days folded into one another like warm quilts, their edges stitched with the sound of wind brushing pine boughs and the rhythm of two people learning how not to fear silence. The fire never died, not truly. It whispered through the nights, fed by careful hands and the quiet trust growing between them. Florence moved through the cabin with greater ease now, though her body still remembered the ache of frost and grief. Her hands, once cracked and blue, were now steady enough to carve vegetables, patch clothing, and braid her hair. Tasani had not touched her. Not once. And somehow, that made her feel more seen than she ever had in a marriage defined by control. He did not look at her with desire or disgust. He looked at her like she was a story worth reading slowly. On a morning when the sky was clear and the sun painted gold along the tree trunks, Florence stood outside, breathing in the thawing air. The forest no longer seemed to press in on her. Instead, it felt like something alive but kind, watchful, yes, but not judgmental. She watched Tasani from across the clearing. He was mending the roof, balanced like part of the wood itself. Each movement precise, measured. He didn't rush even when the wind turned sharp. He caught her watching once. She expected him to look away. But he didn't. He held her gaze. Not long, but long enough for something to spark between them. Not fire. Not yet. But the ember of something waiting. That night, she asked to help him with the beadwork he often did by the fire. At first he hesitated, then slid a small pouch toward her. Inside were turquoise chips and bone beads, a needle and sinew thread. "My wife made these before she passed," he said, voice quiet, like memory walking on soft snow. "I keep finishing what she started." Florence looked at the half-done necklace in his hands, and touched it like one might touch sacred cloth. "I lost her to the same wind that nearly took you," he added. "She gave birth. The baby lived a breath. She did not." Florence did not ask more. Her throat swelled too tight. They worked in silence. Her stitches were clumsy at first, but he didn't correct her. When her thread tangled, he gently untwisted it, never taking the needle from her hands. Just pointing. Waiting. Later, after the fire settled to a low pulse and the cabin had gone still, Florence stared at the necklace on the table. "You loved her deeply," she said. Tasani nodded, still gazing at the flames. "I still do. Love is not undone by death. It just changes shape." Florence closed her eyes. She dreamed that night of her daughter, wrapped in sunlight rather than snow. In the dream, Juniper's tiny hand reached out, not for help, but for blessing, as if letting go had never meant forgetting. The next day, Florence cut her hair. Not much. Just the bottom fringe. She took the strands outside and scattered them into the wind. When she came back in, Tasani looked at her hair, then at her eyes. "You buried something," he said, not asking. "I needed room to grow something else," she replied. That night, he placed a hand-carved comb beside her place at the fire. Nothing was said, but the gesture filled her with more warmth than all the wood burning behind them. Later that week, Florence asked if she could walk to the ridge alone. Tasani nodded once and handed her a pouch of pine nuts and a small blade for safety. When she reached the top of the hill, she sat on a fallen log and wept. Not from sadness, but from the strange relief of being allowed to feel without consequence. The trees did not scold her. The wind did not mock her. She could cry here and still be strong. When she returned that evening, her cheeks were raw, but her eyes held light. Not brightness. Something gentler, like an ember in ash, waiting. She stepped inside the cabin and paused. A small pot sat simmering on the hearth, venison stew, richer than usual. Tasani glanced up from sharpening his knife. "I thought you'd be cold," he said. Florence didn't answer right away. She walked over, placed her hand briefly on his shoulder, and then sat down to eat. It was the first time she had touched him. The sky outside filled with frost stars. Inside, the warmth held them like old friends gathered close. Later, as she swept the hearth clean, she found something tucked into the edge of the firewood stack, a scrap of leather etched with her name in careful, practiced strokes. She turned, eyes wide. Tasani stood by the door, fastening his coat. "I thought you might want to be remembered in this place," he said, as if the gesture were as small as offering a cup of tea. "I already am," she replied, her voice almost breaking. He looked at her, his expression unreadable, but not unfeeling. Then he opened the door and stepped into the night. That evening, she laid the leather beside her daughter's locket. 2 names. 2 pieces of her heart, resting quietly on the mantel. Days passed, and slowly a rhythm bloomed, like roots creeping through frost-hardened ground. They began walking together at dawn, short walks, then longer ones. Sometimes they didn't speak at all. Sometimes they shared stories so old they tasted like dust and firelight. She told him about her mother's songs, about Evan's cruelty, about the shame of staying and the fear of leaving. He told her about his father's horse, about the first time he made fire alone in the woods, about the wife who never complained, even when death circled like a hawk. "You speak of her with love, not sorrow," Florence said one morning. "I have room for both," he answered. That night, she laid 2 mugs of spruce tea before them. Her hands shook only slightly as she sat beside him. "I have room for both, too," she said quietly. His hand, slow and steady, reached across the table and rested near hers. Not touching, just waiting. She moved her fingers, let them rest atop his. A simple thing. But it felt like lighting a lantern in the middle of a long winter road. Later, they sat by the fire, her head resting against the edge of his shoulder, not fully leaning, just touching. She asked what her name sounded like in his language. He thought a long time before answering. "I would call you Azzie Najoni," he said softly. "Beautiful woman." She smiled, tears catching at the corners of her lashes. "No one's called me beautiful since before I was a bride." He didn't reply, but his silence held more honesty than any flattery ever could. Outside, the snow softened into rain. Inside, the fire breathed gently. And somewhere between their heartbeats, something too fragile for words began to take shape. Not love. Not yet. But something holy. Something warm. And it waited. The trail into the nearest trading post was narrow and frostbitten, a vein of brown earth threading through the woods. Florence stepped over frozen roots with care, her breath rising in small clouds. The air had begun to shift, less sharp, more forgiving, but still laced with the bite of late winter. Tasani walked beside her, not leading, not following. Just there. His silence wasn't heavy anymore. It walked like a companion, not a wall. They didn't speak much, but their footsteps shared a rhythm. In the stillness of the forest, even that felt like intimacy. Florence wore the moccasins he'd gifted her weeks ago. Her patched shawl was tucked into a coat he had stitched from elk hide and lined with fur. It still carried the scent of cedar and smoke, home, now. A place she had once believed she'd never find again. The trading post sat at the edge of a thawing river, a weathered building with smoke trailing from its crooked chimney. A few horses stood tied to railings out front. Dogs barked in the distance. A windmill creaked, slow and steady, like it had been waiting for someone to listen. Florence hesitated at the door. Tasani noticed. His voice came low and certain. "No one here owns your story." She nodded, pressed her hand to the locket under her blouse, and stepped inside. The room was warm and crowded with old scents, gunpowder, tobacco, flour, pine. Several men stood by the counter, trading pelts and jars of preserves. A child peeked over a barrel, eyes wide. Behind the counter stood a gray-bearded man who nodded as they entered. No one said a word, but eyes flicked toward her, then to Tasani, then back to her. Whispers rose like dust. Florence kept her head high, not defiant, but still. She asked for cloth, soap, and salt. Her voice did not tremble, not even when a sharp-boned woman near the flour sacks leaned close to another and muttered something loud enough to hear. Thought she was dead, left out in the snow. Evan's wife. Florence turned, met the woman's stare. Evan buried a child, not a wife. The room went quiet. Tasani stepped slightly forward, his posture relaxed but unwavering. His presence was enough. No one spoke again. She paid in trade, her stitching, her preserves, her labor woven into every item exchanged. Worth was no longer a question. Outside, she exhaled, long and slow. Tasani didn't ask how she felt. Instead, he handed her a strip of dried apple. "Good," she said after a while, chewing thoughtfully. "Tastes like things don't have to stay bitter." He gave a soft smile. Almost. The ride back was quiet. The sun touched the tops of trees, pouring gold through the branches. Birds returned to the thawing land, their song shy but growing bolder. Florence broke the silence first. "Do you believe people can be born again without dying?" Tasani considered that for a long time. "I believe grief carves us open. But sometimes, it plants something there too." She nodded, fingers brushing the leather bag against her hip. Inside were small packets of seeds, sunflowers, mint, and something labeled simply as Wild Bloom. When they reached the cabin, Florence moved like someone returning to sacred ground. She paused to run her hand along the doorframe, grounding herself. She turned to him. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For letting me walk beside you. For not fixing me." "I never thought you were broken," he replied. That night, she wrote her daughter's name on a piece of birch bark and burned it in the hearth. Not to forget, but to offer it skyward. The days that followed moved softer. She began tending a small plot beside the cabin, turning soil with her hands, whispering names into the dirt like prayer. She planted every seed with intention, as if each one might hold a piece of her returning self. Tasani crafted a bench for her. Set it near the garden. She painted it with crushed berries and ash, her fingertips stained red. They laughed more now. Not often. But when they did, it came easy, like old songs remembered. He taught her how to carve, how to read cloud patterns, how to listen for foxes in the underbrush. She taught him how to brew tea with lilac and sage, how to mend seams blindfolded, how to hum lullabies that only mothers knew. Still, they never crossed the space between them fully. Not because they couldn't, but because the space itself had become sacred. Then came the letter, delivered by a trapper who passed through once a month, carrying stories and supplies. He handed it to Florence without looking her in the eye. She unfolded the paper with care. The words were clumsy, ink smudged by what might have been liquor or tears. Evan's handwriting. He wrote of her being alive, of people talking, of wanting her to come back and set things right. At the bottom, one phrase, "You're still my wife. I'll come get you if I have to." Her hands shook. Tasani read the letter silently when she offered it. His jaw tightened. He didn't speak for a long time. Then he folded the paper again and set it on the fire. "We'll leave if you need," he said. Florence shook her head. "No. I've already been taken once. I won't run again." Tasani looked at her then, truly looked. "You are brave." "No," she whispered. "I'm finally free." That night, the cabin didn't feel like a shelter. It felt like a fortress of quiet strength. The fire burned high. The wind tried to claw at the windows, but it found no fear to feed on. They sat side by side. Florence's hand reached across the space and rested on his. This time, he closed his fingers gently around hers. And they stayed like that until the stars came out. Later, long after the candles burned down, she stepped outside into the cool dark. The moonlight spilled across the clearing, silvering the earth. She turned her face to the sky. Behind her, Tasani stood at the door, silent as ever. But she felt him there, like the ground feels the promise of rain before it falls. He walked beside her, even in shadow. And the stars above whispered nothing, content to watch. The fire inside waited, steady. The snow returned in one final gasp before spring, blanketing the earth in a soft hush that whispered of endings. It came down in the early morning, swallowing tracks, muffling birdsong, and quieting even the wind. Florence watched from the window as the trees bowed beneath it, their limbs low and graceful. The fire behind her crackled low, fed carefully, as it always was, by hands that knew not to rush warmth. Tasani was outside splitting wood, bare-handed despite the cold, his breath rising in white clouds. There was something different in the way he moved, measured, but alert. The letter, even burned, had not vanished from their thoughts. Its threat clung like smoke in the rafters. Florence turned from the window and stirred the pot of cornmeal over the hearth. Her motions were automatic, but her mind was elsewhere, replaying every word of Evan's warning, the curl of ink that threatened to drag her backward into the dark. She touched her locket again, always warm now from resting near her heart. He would come. She had known it from the moment she read those words. Evan did not believe in letting go. He believed in possession. And she had stopped being his long before the snow ever fell. Tasani stepped inside, brushing snow from his shoulders, shaking it from his hair. He looked at her, eyes sharp. "He's close," he said. "2 horses. Tracks to the east, about a mile out. They're not hiding." Florence didn't flinch. She met his gaze, then nodded once. "I won't run," she said. "I won't let him take you. I know." She laid the wooden spoon aside and stepped to the wall where the firewood was stacked. From behind the logs, she retrieved the small bundle she had hidden weeks ago, her coat, the knife he'd given her, a pouch of dried herbs, a sliver of mirror. Things she didn't want Evan to touch, if he ever walked into this place. Tasani laid his hand gently on her shoulder. His touch was warm and steady, like everything he ever gave. "You are not alone anymore," he said. "No," she replied. "I never should have been." They waited in silence. The fire grew stronger, not from fear, but from purpose. By late afternoon, hoofbeats broke the hush. Sharp, deliberate. A man who knew how to make an entrance. Florence stood in the center of the cabin, straight-backed, her shawl wrapped tight around her. Tasani stood beside the door, hands loose at his sides. He hadn't strung his bow. He didn't need to. The knock wasn't a knock at all. It was a fist, heavy and sharp against the wood. "You gonna open up?" came the voice, unmistakable, sour with disdain. Tasani moved first, opening the door slow. Snow gusted in. Evan stood there, taller than Florence remembered, or perhaps just puffed up by rage. He wore a long coat lined in fox fur, a revolver at his side, a sneer just barely hidden by his whiskers. "Well," Evan drawled, "look what the wolves dragged in." Florence said nothing. Evan's eyes flicked to Tasani, narrowed. "This your new savior?" he spat. "You out here playing wild woman now?" Tasani didn't speak. He didn't move. But the stillness in him was louder than any threat. "I came to take my wife home," Evan continued, stepping past the threshold. "And don't think I won't go through you to do it." Florence stepped forward. "I am not your wife," she said, voice low but steady. "You buried that woman. Left her in the snow. And she died." "You were hysterical," Evan snapped. "That baby," he caught himself, glanced at the fire. "You've gone soft. Come back before you start thinking this is real." Florence reached beneath her shawl and pulled out the locket. She held it out, not to give to him, but to show him. She was real. Juniper. And I'm done letting her be a ghost for your pride. Evan's face flushed. "Don't test me, Florence." "She's not," Tasani said, his voice like granite ground smooth by river water. "She's choosing." Evan's hand went to his pistol. Tasani didn't move. Florence stepped between them. "You want to shoot someone? Then shoot me," she said. "But know this, there's no one left to fear you. You don't own me, Evan. You never did. You just held the door shut and called it love." He froze. The wind howled against the cabin, a low wail through the trees. Evan's hand trembled. "I lost everything," he whispered. "You were all I had." "You never wanted me," Florence said softly. "You wanted silence. Obedience. You wanted someone to hurt quieter than you did." She reached out and pushed the gun down with one finger. And now you want her back. But she's ash. And you can't warm yourself on what you burned. Evan looked between them, at the fire, at the man who didn't flinch, at the woman who no longer trembled. Then, with a bitter sound like a man spitting out blood, he turned and stormed out into the snow. They watched from the doorway as he mounted his horse. For a moment, he looked back. And then he was gone. The forest swallowed the hoofbeats. Silence returned. Tasani closed the door. Florence stood still for a long while. Then she sank to her knees beside the hearth, pressing her hands to the floor. Not in collapse. In gratitude. She whispered a name. Not Evan's. Juniper's. And then her own. "I'm still here," she said, a breath more than a deflorenciation. Tasani knelt beside her, his hand resting lightly on her back. Spring came that night. Not all at once. But it began. The snow melted slower than it had fallen. Birds sang with cautious hope. Buds trembled on the branches. And in the small garden Florence had carved into the earth with her bare hands, a single green shoot broke through the soil. She planted more. Rows of them. Sunflowers. Mint. Wild bloom. Tasani built a new fence, his hands steady as ever. Together, they sanded a cradle. Not because they needed one, but because Florence wanted to remember love in its beginning form. They hung wind chimes made of old silver spoons, and their song carried through the trees like laughter. One day, Florence returned from the riverbank with her skirt wet to the knees, her hands full of wild violets. She found Tasani carving names into a plank of wood. Juniper, Azze Nijoni, and his own. He didn't ask permission. He simply handed her the blade. Florence added one more word. That night, they sat on the bench beside the garden, fingers loosely laced, fireflies floating around them like stars learning how to walk the earth. No words were needed. The fire inside the cabin still burned. But now, it was fed not by survival, by choice, by presence, by the long, slow truth of healing. Ashes melted the snow, and in the thaw, something sacred bloomed.